She was playing the organ when two German officers walked straight into the church and asked her to play something beautiful for them, and her fingers didn't even shake, because if they had they would have felt the tiny vibration humming right under the wood beneath her hands, and that hum was a live enemy radio transmission hidden inside the organ itself, and one wrong note or one strange click and everyone she was protecting would have been shot against that very wall. So she just smiled and played louder, and that is how a quiet nun spent 4 straight years decoding enemy secrets right under the Nazis' noses without anyone ever knowing. And if you love real stories like this that history tried to forget and you're new here to The Secret Nun, hit that subscribe button right now, because we find the stories they never told you in school, and we're just getting started, and what she did with that organ is going to leave you staring at your screen. Because her name was Sister Agnes, and before the war she wasn't a spy or a soldier or anything close to it. She was just the music sister in a small stone convent in northern France near the Belgian border, and that matters because she was the only one who knew how that old church organ actually worked inside and out. So when everything changed in the summer of 1940 and the German army rolled through her town and took over every building that mattered, she didn't run and she didn't hide, because there was nowhere to go, and the convent became a place where people whispered instead of sang, and the church itself was suddenly not just a church anymore. It was a checkpoint and a meeting point and a place the Germans liked to use because it was tall and it was central and it had excellent acoustics, and that gave her an idea that would save hundreds of lives. And that idea started with a broken organ pipe and a man who showed up at the back door late one night soaking wet and bleeding. So he was a young British radio operator whose plane had been shot down, and the French resistance had dragged him through the fields to the convent because the sisters were known for never turning anyone away, and he was carrying a radio set that was far too big to hide under a floorboard and far too dangerous to keep anywhere the Germans would search. And he kept saying they need to listen, they need to decode, they need to know what the Germans are planning before it happens. And Sister Agnes just listened because she was good at listening, and then she looked at the giant church organ that took up the entire back wall, and she realized it was hollow in places that no one ever checked, and it was noisy in a way that could hide other noises, and it was sacred, so the Germans almost never searched it thoroughly out of superstition. And so that very night they took that radio apart piece by piece, and they slid it up inside the organ casing right behind the largest wooden pipes where the air chest pumped, and they ran a thin wire up through the bellows, and they hid the small Morse key under the lowest pedal board where her foot could tap it without anyone seeing. And from that moment on, every time she sat down to play, she was sitting on top of a secret that could kill her. And that is where the decoding started, because just hiding a radio wasn't enough, and this is the part people always misunderstand. She wasn't just hiding it for someone else to use. She was the one who had to learn how to use it, because the British operator was too injured to stay, and the resistance fighter who knew Morse code was arrested 2 weeks later. So it was just her and the soft crackle coming through the hidden earpiece she wove into her wimple, and at first it was just noise to her. Just dots and dashes that meant nothing. But she had something no soldier had, and that was a musician's ear. So she started to hear the patterns the way you hear a melody, and she realized enemy radio traffic had a rhythm too. It had repeating intros, and it had call signs, and it had time blocks, and because she played organ every single day for hours, she could sit there and listen for hours without looking suspicious. And so she started writing down what she heard on tiny slips of paper she hid inside her hymnal, and she would tap back confirmations with her toe on the pedal key while her hands kept playing a Bach prelude so smoothly that no one in the pews ever knew her foot was sending a life or death message in code. So think about what that actually looked like day to day, because it wasn't dramatic every minute, it was terrifyingly normal, and that is what kept her alive. Every morning she would wake before dawn and pray with the other sisters, and then she would go to the organ loft to practice, and practice was her cover. So she would start the bellows, which made a deep whooshing sound, and that whoosh perfectly covered the tiny click of the radio receiver turning on, and then she would play and listen at the same time, and her job was to catch the German field transmissions that were bouncing in the clear at scheduled times. And because the Germans thought their codes were unbreakable, they often sent routine orders in the same format, and she learned that format like a hymn: first the unit ID, then the location grid, then the action. And once she cracked that pattern, she could decode an entire troop movement just by hearing the shape of it, and she would translate the grid numbers using a map hidden under the altar cloth, and then she would write the message in tiny handwriting and fold it into a loaf of bread or a sack of potatoes, and a resistance boy would come to collect the offering for the poor and carry it straight to the forests where the local marquis were waiting. And of course the danger kept rising, because the longer it went on, the more the Germans trusted her, and that trust was deadly, because they started requesting concerts. They loved that she played, They would sit in the front pews with their rifles resting against the chairs and ask for Ave Maria or Beethoven, and she would have to play beautifully while decoding their own orders about the very people sitting right there. And there were days when she decoded a message that said they were going to raid a farmhouse that night where a Jewish family was hiding, and she had to keep playing and not react at all and just find a way to get the warning out within the hour. And she did, every single time, because she learned to slip a note to the choir boy who would run out the sacristy door as if to fetch more hymn books. And that boy would sprint through the fields and beat the Germans by minutes, and that is why for 4 years no raid that was ordered over the radio in her sector ever succeeded. And the Germans started to think they had a leak somewhere else, and they tore apart the town hall and they arrested the mayor, and they never once looked inside the organ. But they almost caught her, and this is the moment where everything nearly ended in the winter of 1941 when a German communications officer who actually understood radios came to inspect the church for a new antenna site, and he stood in that organ loft for a long time just listening, and he said the organ sounded odd. He said there was a secondary hum and Sister Agnes felt her heart stop, but she didn't stop playing. She just pulled a louder stop, and she said the bellows were old and leaky, and would they like her to show them the leather? And he nodded, and so she opened the side panel away from the radio side and let him see the dusty leather flapping and the creaking wood, and he lost interest because to him it was just church junk. But that night she didn't sleep at all because she knew the hum was getting louder as the radio's vacuum tubes aged, and so she and the old groundskeeper stayed up all night packing thin wool around the radio casing to muffle it, and that worked, and it kept working. But from then on she played with one ear always tilted just enough to hear if anyone was climbing the loft stairs. Then 1942 and 1943 became a blur of close calls that made her even better under pressure because the Germans installed a garrison right next to the convent, and that meant more radio traffic, which meant more chances to decode, but also more eyes. And she had to get creative, so she started using the different organ stops as a code for the resistance. Like if she played a certain hymn at Vespers, it meant the drop zone was clear. And if she added a strange improvisation at the end, it meant stay away, and the villagers who were in on it never had to be told twice, and the Germans just thought she was very devotional. And one freezing night she decoded a message about a train full of forced laborers that was going to be rerouted through their town to the east, and she passed that single frequency and timing to the resistance, and they blew the tracks in exactly the right spot 2 hours later, and 50 men escaped into the woods and were hidden by the convent in the cellar for weeks, and she kept playing the organ over their heads to cover the sound of them breathing when soldiers came to search, and no one was found because no one ever suspects music to be the hiding place. And she paid a price for that kind of courage that you don't see in movies, because she couldn't tell anyone what she was really doing, not even the other sisters fully, because the fewer people who knew, the fewer could be forced to talk. So she carried 4 years of secrets alone, and she started losing weight, and her hands would cramp from playing for 6 hours straight and still tapping with her toe, and her ears would ring at night from listening to static through a hidden wire, but she never stopped because every week she was pulling something useful out of the air, like fuel depot locations and patrol schedules, and once even the name of a collaborator who was marking houses for deportation, and that collaborator vanished after the resistance got her note, and the deportations stopped in that town. And she never said a word about it, she just played the next hymn a little more gently, and that is the quiet kind of heroism that doesn't get a medal, it just keeps people alive. So by early 1944 everything was building toward the invasion. Everyone knew was coming, but no one knew where or when, and the radio traffic became frantic and almost constant, and for weeks she was decoding 18 hours a day, catching fragments about coastal reinforcements and fuel shortages and panicked orders. And then in late May she caught a sequence she had never heard before, and it was being repeated over and over with an urgency that made her hands go cold, and it was a repositioning order. A whole panzer division was being pulled back from the coast near Normandy to refuel inland near her town, and if that division stayed inland the beaches would be vulnerable, but if it was sent back early thousands more Allied soldiers would die, and she knew she had to get this out immediately, and she did. She tapped it out with her foot while a German captain stood 10 feet away listening to her play and nodding approvingly, and the resistance carried it that night and London got it within hours, and historians now know that decision to keep that division inland for just 2 extra days was one of the reasons the landings didn't fail, and it started with a nun's toe on a hidden key. Then came June 6 and the bells rang and chaos broke out and the Germans were screaming orders and running and the town was locked down. But Sister Agnes just stayed at the organ and decoded the retreat orders as they flew, and she passed the safe corridors to the resistance so families could escape the shelling, And when the Americans finally rolled in 3 days later, they found her still in the loft, still playing, because she was covering the sound of the last radio transmission she would ever need to make, a final message that said the town is clear, the bridge is intact, and then she finally turned the set off, and she sat there in the silence and wept because for the first time in 4 years there was no hum under her hands, just wood, and she had done it. She had kept that secret inside music for 1,461 days without a single soul on the enemy side ever figuring it out. And after the war she never bragged, she never asked for recognition, she just went back to teaching the children hymns and tending the garden, and the organ was eventually restored and the radio was removed and hidden away in a museum basement where it sat and labeled for decades because she told no one she wanted it displayed, and the only record was a small note in the resistance logs that said source organist reliable, and it took 50 years for a military historian to trace that call sign back to her convent and finally ask her what really happened, and she just smiled and said she only played what she was given to play, but by then the people she had saved had already told their grandchildren, and one of those grandchildren is how we know this story at all, because courage like that doesn't disappear, it just waits for someone to listen closely enough to hear it, just like she did. So if this story hit you the way it hit me, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what moment gave you chills the most. Was it the German officer asking for a beautiful song while the radio was humming, or that Panzer Division message that changed D-Day? Because I read every single comment and your thoughts keep these forgotten stories alive, and share this with someone who still believes one quiet person can change history. Send it to a friend, send it to your family group chat. Because stories like Sister Agnes's deserve to be heard far beyond this channel. And if you haven't already, subscribe to The Secret Nun and ring that bell so you don't miss the next secret we uncover, because every week we bring you a true story of courage hidden in plain sight, just like this one, and there are so many more we haven't told you yet.